Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, I know we ditched last week. There was a slight scheduling conflict, but I know a lot has happened. But I will say, in order to cope to justify our scheduling issues, actually sitting on some of this stuff for a week, I think, has given more of an angle to the current stories because we could have jumped right into it. We could have covered stuff without seeing the immediate consequences of it. But now we have plenty to go over. Of course, with Ukraine, a lot of major shifts on the front line. The Middle East, certainly. And then some news items here and there. Not that much out of the rest of the world. It's mostly going to be about Ukraine, the Middle East, which I think has become a bit of a standard fare here. But I do have some miscellaneous news items about Europe I'll get into, some domestic stuff in the US, and a couple of East Asia items if we do have time. But without further ado, I imagine you want to take it from here.
Yeah, so let's get into the maps. Um, there's, as usual, quite a few of them. Uh, Let me see. Okay, we will start with the first one, which is basically the southern and Donetsk front. It's the Donetsk front, but we're looking at the southern part. Today, the major news has been that Ugledar has finally fell. Battles for it began 2 years ago, October 28th. So a year and 11 months. And it went pretty quickly. And I think maybe the big telltale sign that the Russians were going to take it fairly quickly after several failed attempts. And the one in January, February was quite costly. But as you can see on the map, that big chunk to the left, to the west of that those red outlines where Ugledar is, that's a very big chunk. And when I saw Russia taking those areas like Prichistina in 2 3 days, I knew like the Ukrainians had to be outmanned and outgunned. And we'll get into it because there's a whole story of the 72nd and some of the sort of dismal command of the Ukrainians. But let's take a look at a close up of what has been happening. So the next slide basically is a close up of Ugledar, which is in and of itself not huge, but it is almost entirely all Soviet era apartment high rises. And they do not have big windows like condos that became popular from the mid late 80s onwards. These are incredibly difficult to break. They're very resilient, and what's more is they have very resilient basements. But again, when we saw the highway leading into Ugledar that goes all the way to Konstantinovka fell, that was kind of like another sign that the Russians were much more prepared. They were working on the flanks. The reason they could work on the flanks is they just have more men. The attrition rate for the Ukrainians has not been good. So it was the right time to attack. They just have a much more capable commander than they used to. Now, if we zoom out to look back at the big picture, this is what Weeb Union and actually myself as well think is happening. So you see the push from the south from Ugledar and that from the Pokrovsk front, let's say around Ukrainsk and west of there. What the Russians are going to try to do is moving from Ugledar. You notice that they're going on a upward angle, um, let's say north by northwest. What do you see there? Well, you see very few uh, fortifications. The Russians are also wanting to move south, as I've been saying for like since the beginning of September. That they're going to go up to Pokrovsk and then they're going to want to move south. They want to get rid of all those pockets that are underneath the Pokrovsk front, and they're going to want to even out the line because an even line basically means fewer men uh, positioning themselves along a longer line that is windy. Okay. Um, uh, we we can ignore the next slide. Then just a bit of news. Of course, the Russians are moving from Konstantinovka. Konstantinovka is north of Ugledar, south of the Pokrovsk front, like Ukrainsk. Um, they captured just a little bit of territory around Katerinovka, which is just south of Antonovka. This is an important settlement. That slide that I showed you previously with the two arrows, one of them will go through this area, and that is why they will want to clear this out. Then we go to the Pokrovsk front. You can see the next slide. The Russians have Novogrodovka. They have expanded their area. This was one of the strangest attacks by the Russians in that the Ukrainians were really caught off guard. They were making some headway in Kursk. This is about 2, 3 weeks ago. Um, and the city fell in less than 3 days. And it's one of the only cities that are not completely blown out, right? Like amazing. And to put it into a larger context, you can see this just south of this area, because actually, if we just remain on the slide, that area that was taken, that's Selidove. Solidove is a town that the Russians made a deep incursion in, and then the Ukrainians pushed them out. Now, it was the 72nd Brigade that I believe pushed them out with the help of the 47th. These are Ukraine's elite NATO trained, NATO equipped brigades. Uh, but in Ugledar, of course, what had happened is the old news was that all of the 72nd Brigade was sent to Kursk. That's not true. A part of it was, and a part of it was intended to stay in Ugledar. Now, the commander of the brigade has been dismissed for losing Ugledar. But try to understand that he's fighting with fewer men. The other two brigades that were in that area were, um, land, territorial brigades. These are not like NATO. They're not elite. Um, and the fighting in Ugledar, it seems like it was very intense. There have been some other fights on the battlefront that have also been very intense. I'll be able to talk about them. There was an article from the Telegraph that came out today quoting a Ukrainian source. Remember, the Telegraph is a British newspaper, and that there were breakouts all evening and morning to not get trapped in Ugledar by the Russians. Now, I have seen photos of Ukrainian men with the green tape uh, aligned in a row. They're dead. Um, at the same time, this Telegraph article is saying 5 out of 10 make it. That is, they made it out, and the other are dead or wounded or captured. Reminds you a lot of Avdiivka back in February, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So what's interesting is the 72nd. I mean, obviously they were forced to hold on to Ugledar for as long as possible, particularly when Zelensky is in America, right? And in many ways, like a great the Ukrainians created a great PR foil with Kursk. But like for a lot of people, where like trying to understand geopolitics and war is like it hurts their brains. So Kursk is a talking point that you can use, right? And it overshadows things like Ugledar, right?
Well, if you want an idea
Um,
of how low information the Kursk offensive was, I believe this was back in August, probably about a week after it happened.
yeah.
You had some Kamala staffer bragging about how, because of Biden's wonderful foreign policy, Ukraine has
Mm,
now pushed into Russia, and they're diverting troops that have been in the Donbass since 2022. And once again, anyone who has followed this war, even in the slightest, knows that's not true. But as far as, like I said, the low information people are concerned, that is true. And they're not going to bother digging, they're not going to bother doing their own research, especially considering the source. They're already going to have a predisposition against any Russian claims, so they're going to write off everything they don't like as Russian propaganda. And they've been told for the past two, in fact, even more years, that the Ukrainians are up to NATO standards, that they've been holding off the Mongol hordes for the past
mm.
2.5 years, maybe even the past 10 years, if they're a little more informed. So, yeah, as far as that's concerned, as far as when it comes to drumming up support, even among the so-called quote-unquote elite, how many of these people in Congress do you think follow these maps? How many people do you think in the
Yeah,
okay, maybe the State Department and Pentagon are different because that they do select for a certain kind of people, but in terms of just power players, decision makers, legislatures in the U.S., congressional staffers, even when it comes to say like business interests in the U.S., pretty much anyone who's not in the State Department or Pentagon is not going to have the meticulous details or the battle maps in front of them on a near daily basis.
yeah. I mean, it would lose the public to some degree. You could simplify it and make it entertaining too. Like, can you imagine if like an outfit like Southfront had just a little bit more in production money?
Oh
They could
yeah.
easily do something like Kings and Generals, and it would be a lot easier to follow. Now, the vast majority of people, that is still too autistic, and they're not going to go for it. But I mean, they would increase the numbers. In any
If
case,
you just to say one last thing on that point, if you want an idea of how the public perceives this, I recommend all of you look up. I believe it was MSNBC did a hypothetical China-Taiwan war game board game, and just the things they were talking about, the like the moves the Chinese would hypothetically make, and even the Taiwanese for that
oh
matter,
yeah, I
were
saw that.
just
Oh my god. Oh
completely
my god.
out of left field, no basis in reality. So that's how these people, like I said, even these talking heads in the media who you think
Yeah.
would know what they're talking about, at least to some degree, see the situation.
I, I love their quota women. You know, they were involved. Like, bro, are you serious? Come on. So anyways, um next slide gives you an idea of the southern part of the Pokrovsk front south of the town of Ukraine. So you can see where the Russians have expanded and where they want to go. So that Cukurnie is just south. It's got the line around it. The arrows they're pointing down. The Russians are going to want to expand till they get to that waterway. That little lake is a barrier, and it means if you capture it, what's south of you, you're not going to have to worry about because it will be too difficult an attack. Um, right? It gives you cover. It gives you leverage in attacks. And so the next slide is just a close up of how do you Cukurnie, and the town above it is Nekhvoraika. Chudno. Okay, so these are just another small city, big town south of Ukrainsk. None of them are as big as Ukrainsk. Anyhow, that's just positional stuff. Let's move now north of the Pokrovsk front and into the Toretsk, New York front. Since last week, since the last show, there was another very daring move by the Russians. Remember that they did this when they were south of Ochertina. They did it also by going into Konstantinovka, not without some large losses, but just steamrolling with their BTRs or BMPs, and under very heavy fire, they still managed. So if when you're looking at this map, look at the pale outline, right? That lilac color. You see that one long strand going north by northwest, right? That's the attack that I'm talking about. So it's very narrow, And the Ukrainians should have been able to cut that off at many different places and mop up the situation. However, that didn't happen. And it didn't happen for a week. That's another indicator that they are running out of men or ammunition or both. Like, remember that the Russians used this underground pipe, just like they did in Avdiivka in New York, which is south of Toretsk. It's right next to it. You could consider it just a suburb.
I mean, just to play devil's
One
advocate
melds into
here.
the other. Pardon me?
Oh, just to play devil's advocate just for a moment, as you were talking about with that salient that should have been easily cut off. One other consideration, even if we assume that the Ukrainians are at full manpower in this sector, have no ammunition shortages, even if all of that is true, it shows a profound disorganization just on a ground level of the Ukrainian forces at this point, which I think it's frankly all three factors, but
Mm,
regardless, this is not the AFU of September 2022. Uh,
yeah,
Far from. This isn't even the AFU of the 2023 counteroffensive. This is, by
which was
comparison,
arguably even better trained.
yeah, better trained, but by comparison, looking at the results, this is a disheveled, disorganized mess, and I don't really think there's any more ways you could say that.
Yeah, it's getting very serious. So you notice the big chunk that was taken, which has beefed up this strand that's moving north by northwest, right? The Ukrainians pulled out of there. This is an area that's kind of open fields, a bit of forest patches here and there, and two fortifications. But draw now your attention, go northeast, and you're going to see the incursions the Russians have made into Toretsk proper, right? This area is an area just north of New York. But I just consider this whole thing Toretsk, New York agglomeration because it's really just one place. You know, in some countries this would all be under one municipality. So now notice that northernmost section that the Russians have taken in the last week with that incursion going deep in to Toretsk. Very interesting attack. I saw this pointed out. It might have been Weeb Union or it might have been Dima from Military Summary. So there is a building that is supposedly filled with Russians. The Ukrainians drive with their Humvees. They have mines with them. They pull out. They begin shooting into the building to hold it, right? Once they come to a stop. Of course, they have a turret on top with like, uh, probably a brownie or a 50 millimeter, right? That's shooting at the building as they're closing in. And they lay mines and then they take off. It's kind of like what the Russians have been doing. And these are even bigger mines. And the middle of the building just collapses. Now it's not a big building. It's two, maybe three stories. I feel like it was 2 stories high. Um, the Russians are still there. I don't know if there was if like you don't see any Russians in the video, but it is to say that it is very creative. Like finally, the Ukrainians are copying a little bit of the kind of innovations that the Russians have introduced. Because the Russians, for instance, have been using motorcycles for over a year now, and in many cases very effectively. That's really been part of the reason they've had success in Rabotino. They saw that it wasn't just themselves, but even the Ukrainians could not move in Rabotino without enormous losses, because both sides have very capable artillery and guide and surveillance systems that allow them to attack armored columns. So, anyways, that's the battle for New York Toretsk, and it's developing. Now we go further north. Constantine, if you could please ignore the first, second, third. No, ignore the first and second, and just go to the third slide, and then we'll move back up if you don't mind. Okay,
Got it.
this is an overview of the Kremenaya Kupiansk front. You can see there have been some small gains here and there. Um, so I just wanted you to take a look at that, and then the slide above it gives you an idea of what the Russians are trying to do. Um, Again, this is just sort of north. This is east, sorry, west northwest of Kremenaya, which is you can't really see in the map, but that red arrow indicates the Zherabets River. The Zherabets River is east of the Oskal River, and in this area of Ukraine, it tends to go north-south, and this is the area that the Russians want to take. They want to take it, and they're going to follow with the river to their right, and this will allow them to use fewer men to start working down. Because you see this area, you see that big purple outline? That used to be Russian, and the Ukrainians, since July, have been able to I mean, actually, since June, have been able to push the Russians back further and further away from Torsk. At one point, the Russians actually got very close to Torsk, but um, Nevsky is the one of the latest towns that the Russians have captured. It belongs to Lugansk, and they've now. I think there's like 1/10 of 1% left. And then if you move one more further up, I know. I'm sorry, we're working backwards. Makievka. So Makievka is the latest town that has fallen. I believe that fell yesterday in this area. And then today, just to stick with this area, you can see on the last slide they've increased some more of their territory. These are just farm fields. They're just evening out the line. They've this is sort of east southeast of Nevsky, and they're going to push towards the Zherabets River basically. So, anyways, that's that. Then the next two slides is we have a region that we haven't been talking about very much at all, and that's the Russian Kursk offensive that has just been stagnant in Volchansk or Volchansk for I don't know ever since June, and the Ukrainians have managed to regain the aggregate plant. This is it's I mean there's nothing left of it. I'm going to you put up the slide and then the first slide and then move to the second slide and then I'm gonna send you something that like gives you an idea of just how what kind of ruination and desolation this place is now. It's almost unfathomable. Yes, I'm gonna send it now. Yes, so that is Vovchansk, that purple outline. The Ukrainians have taken it back. Dima today, in his latest video, says the Russians have again re-entered and taken about 10% of it. Now, there's at the bottommost of the slide series, Konstantin. I'm just sent you like what does this place actually look like? There is almost nothing left of this city. There's virtually nothing. There's virtually nothing left of the plant. I can assure you it did not look like this 2 months ago or even a month ago. So if you just go to the bottom, you can see that the Russians are dropping their fabs. Now, what's interesting though, and kind of not good for the Russians, is they sent in a column. They'd been bombing this place for a while. That had stopped. I don't know how armored this column was. I don't know how big it was. So I'm just going basically by what Dima said. He said he mentioned it in another video. I watched both videos where he's mentioned it, but there's no link or anything. What he said was basically that the Russians had gone into this area, uh, and there were still machine gun nests. So, a lot of these places that get bombed and, like people can survive. Like even if you destroy a building, like they're capable. So these guys simply climb back up and were able to were able to totally defeat the Russian column. And as Dima put it, some never got the chance to retreat. I haven't seen the footage, but I remember watching this bombing in the days previous to the Russian assault. In any case, the other news as far as the front lines, Let's go to now the Kursk offensive. We'll begin with the first map, which gives you an idea of like just what the map looks like now. The pale yellow outlines are the areas that the Russians have taken. The red outlines are what the Russians have taken in the last day or two, and then the purple and blue are outlines of what the Ukrainians have taken. Now you can see uh, that big white outline, that little blob. That's what the Russians took a few weeks ago. You can see to the east of that there is an incursion, and remember, this is the line that I kept talking about. There's a line, one single line of fortifications beneath it, and there is a town that the Russians have probably lost, and is Veselya. Veselya is the area now. They've got it in the gray zone. That's the best information I could get for today. It might have fallen by now, but maybe by next show we should know. If you go to the, if we refer back to the overview of the Kursk area in the right bottom hand corner, you can see the area that the Russians have taken, and they're in a place called Plekhovo. This is right along the Ukrainian-Russian border.
Yes,
The
and if you
Russians are
do
going to,
notice, just with this overview of the Kursk offensive or counteroffensive at this point,
yeah,
practically, except that one salient right there, still controlled by the Ukrainians, the Russians have pushed it back to the Ukrainian border.
yes, yes. And so maybe the last slide gives you an idea of what each side is trying to do, right? So this very last slide, you can see that Ukrainians want to push behind. They want to get into the rear of the Russian positions. They have to go above that defense line, as you can see where the arch is. And what the Russians want to do is they want to go after Suja, and Suja is in the middle there, circled, and you can see that they want to create a pincer movement. They want to close off access going back into Ukraine for all those troops, the Ukrainian troops that are in Kursk. And so they're going to try to keep moving northwestwards and southeastwards until they get to Suja, because that's really the gateway for the Ukrainians to get back into Ukraine. The other kind of notable things that have been happening on the part of for the Russians, besides the typical deep strikes and stuff like that, is they've begun targeting more and more bridges. The third bridge in the last few days was destroyed just outside of Pokrovsk. Another train station was destroyed there. Two incidents where trains were destroyed. One had ammunition. It still started to move while it was burning, and then the ammunition started going. There is a nighttime vision video of this. The other is um, one that had actually supplies. This is in an area west of Pokrovsk that was intended for the 72nd that was guarding Ugledar. And that to me tells me, that's pretty either luck or good intelligence. So uh, that might have been one of the reasons why Ugledar fell. I mean, I think Ugledar was going to fall anyways. Um, for one, the Russians had learned from their mistakes. The mistakes were costly. You have to learn. They dismissed the Dagestani commander that was involved in that brigade assault. The other is, uh, I mean, part of the reason the Russians are making these gains, from the Kremenaya Svatovo front in the Kupiansk direction all the way down to Ugledar, is because they've decided that they're going to go with this Kursk thing. You know, um, Maybe they feel they have to. Maybe they feel like that is what they have to do to get money. I don't know. Um, you would, I mean, everything is all talk, right? Like everything in the news is absolute hype, right? Like if Russia really was this incredible threat, and it's not just arguments and talking points, right? Like the West would just stop right now. Like you wouldn't have debates about funding Ukraine. You would just do it. Like you wouldn't make a fanfare of it. Like they wouldn't do PR stunts. Like they wouldn't try to, take over Crimea with like 12 boats, right? Like they wouldn't waste their men like this,
Or
right?
blow up the empty headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet that has not been in Crimea since before the beginning of the war.
Right, right, right. So like it's just I mean the Russians really have not stopped. The Ukrainians are in a fighting retreat. Like that's the best way I can put it. They're in a fighting retreat. It's not like, let's say, a collapse. They're losing. They cannot gain territory. Kursk is like really the only thing. Some small gains in Volchansk, as you saw, but I don't believe that the Russians are committed to Volchansk, right? And in
No,
some
I
ways, you
think
could
they did
argue
Volchansk just to take pressure off of the Kursk front. And
the Donbass front.
uh, yes, that's.
Yeah, they
But
wanted to draw Ukrainian forces away from Donbass because those the battles just to get from like Avdiivka to Ochretine and a little bit beyond, like I mean, a lot of men died just to move that little bit, right? And you saw as soon as Russia opened up that Kursk front, and they were always outnumbered 2-1, but it was enough to draw the Ukrainians up there. In any case, the Kursk thing has so far backfired for the Ukrainians. Like there was some Ukrainian magazine that claimed Putin has ordered his troops to regain Kursk by October the 1st. Have you seen this? This is so stupid. We've
oh,
Union brought it up.
all of
And
the
there's
red
like,
lines that have been imposed on Putin from foreign media.
yeah, like, okay, so when did he say this? Like, literally, they're the only ones saying he said this, and their source is an anonymous source in the Kremlin. Okay, I
Just
mean, I
like Kiev in
guess.
3 days. That was right out of Milley's mouth. There was no Russian official or anyone from the Kremlin who had said that. That's been the trend throughout this war. They keep on saying Russia keeps on backing down on its red lines, but these are red lines that they have imposed on Russia that no Russian official has ever even hinted at.
Yeah, yeah, it's just I don't know. And people. I mean, they fall for it obviously because they want to fall for it, right?
In
It's
fact, if you'll allow me to shift the topic a little to one of the other stories here, when it comes to actual Russian red lines, we have to look at what actually happened within the past week. The Ukrainians were snubbed on the ATACMS and on the Storm Shadows. They are, for the foreseeable future, not getting them, and frankly, probably not getting them from until this war is over, if even then. I don't know. They might authorize, oh, you can use them if the war reignites after whatever peace agreement they go to. Just,
yeah, yeah,
just, just looking, I don't know, 5 years in the future, just to give a rough number on that. But once again, once the Russians actually drew a red line with the updating of their nuclear and defense doctrines, the West backed off. And I think that's also a sign that they have little interest in continuing this war. And in retrospect, looking at the Kursk offensive, looking at the push for the use of Storm Shadows in particular, also with the ATACMS and even the Taurus missiles from Germany, it does look like part of that. I think it was multifaceted. The Kursk offensive had many purposes, but part of the PR angle is that if they show they can push into Russia, if they show they can have an incursion and hold that territory for a significant amount of time, the West will feel a renewed confidence in Ukraine and approve the usage of these more advanced weapons. But that didn't pan
I
out.
think that's absolutely 100%.
Yeah, and because a lot of people like to talk about PR, which, like I said, that was part of it. Um, of course, I also do hold that it was to prevent a Sumy offensive as well, because the Russians were preparing that. And I think their lofty goal was to put the power plant, the nuclear power plant in Kursk, under even just threat of fire, but clearly they didn't get that far. But I do think now that the dust has mostly settled in this, and that the Kursk offensive has completely collapsed within the next few weeks, we'll probably see them expelled from Russia proper altogether. That a large part of this, especially in conjunction with Zelensky's world tour, once again, was wanting to get the approval for if not the ATACMs, if not the Storm Shadows, some sort of advanced weaponry. And you could say that's what made them ended up rushing the F-16s, because you'll notice the F-16s did actually arrive around the time of the Kursk offensive. Now, we've seen what happened to the F-16 since, but I do think it was that last ditch effort to try to regain the confidence of their wavering Western sponsors, and we've seen the result of that. And like I said, he flew out all the way to New York, did the clown show at the UN, met not only with Biden but also with Harris and Trump, and once again was supposed to be on top of the world, having secured the confidence of the current administration as well as any possible future if either when either of the two get into power. And then it all just falls apart on him, and like, no, this isn't happening. We all, for those of them who were in the know in the State Department, in the Pentagon, even some in the White House, knew that Ugladar's collapse was just a matter of time. Of course, they weren't going to publicly say it, but what happened behind closed doors is probably look at your front line, look at the position, look at your failed Kursk offensive. We're not escalating this any further. Yes, we will continue to support you to save face and to try to knock the Russians down a peg, but your war effort, your dreams of 2022, your dreams of retaking Crimea, it's done. It's over. Like I said, we will continue to support you in order to inflict maximum damage on the Russians, but ultimately, you're a meat shield. Now, I don't imagine those exact words were used, but that was probably to the effect of what Zelensky was told behind closed doors in New York.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sums up what the reasons why not just Kursk, but why Zelensky's trip to the States was essentially uneventful, and you could even dare say it was a failure. Now, he did get a few billions of dollars, not much. I think, what was it, 2.5? Israel got something like 8.7 billion,
Yes,
right?
and on top
Just
of that, it was just an they expedited funds already allocated to Ukraine, so it wasn't any new funding.
yes, that's right. That's right. I forgot about that. Notice how Israel got so much more. I mean, it's the boss,
Our
right?
greatest ally, okay? Look, we saw what happened to them today. They clearly need it, okay? Because we're gonna strike back against the Iranian terror regime. Don't worry, we'll get plenty into that. But as you were saying,
Yeah, yeah. So, I'm honestly surprised. I haven't, discounted, so, what some of the blowhards like that guy Goncharenko. He was in the Rada today. The Alexei, I think, is his first name, saying, "What are we afraid of? Why are we not striking Russia? Like, just for Skripal,
correct me.
like, we should have bombed Moscow just for that." Like, they really want to paint this picture like nothing will happen if you do it, right? Like, you can tell they're so
Okay,
frustrated. They're
correct me if
so
I'm
frustrated.
wrong, but he's one of the ones who's big on lowering the conscription age, right?
Yes, him with the short hair. He has an extremely Ukrainian face. I've known three Ukrainian guys in my life, buddies of mine. One of them sadly died a few years ago, no, 2 years ago, and like, they have his face. So I know that face, right?
Oh, and this is even pre-war. They've been there for like a century. There's huge diaspora Ukrainian community near me, and now that you mention it, I've seen his face in dozens of different grown men.
Yes. Now the funny now this son of a bitch, he was one of the guys that killed those 50 protesters in Odessa in 2014 in May. I remember when they, or it might have been April, but I think it was May 1st or 2nd,
May 2nd.
where May 2nd, that's right, where anybody who jumped out of the windows, or came back out of, outside from the building, from any doors, back or front, were attacked or shot, or just beaten to death, right? He was there. Like, so you can tell this guy, he's a complete fanatic. He's a total fanatic. And he knows Ukraine is losing, um, and he knows there's almost nothing that can be done about it. He's gotta blame somebody. And so, like I said, the new wonder weapon of the US is hitting Russian cities, not in Rostov on Don and Crimea, but hitting them up north of Kursk. Like, I mean, they had their chance. They hit the Zaporizhia the Kursk nuclear power plant twice, but they lost 5 HIMARS systems. Like, think about that. And I am convinced that, like, one of the reasons you hardly see any HIMAR attacks now, I might have to eat my words tomorrow, but let's face it, the last 2, 3 weeks we haven't seen any of them attack. And that can't just be that they're low on munitions, right? They've lost these units, and I would dare say that probably some American instructors were there. Like, in the first year when the Russians said they destroyed some HIMARS, who knows whether they really did or didn't. But I'm liable to believe that they weren't always lying, or not lying as much as we thought. But now there's a video footage all the time.
I
So.
don't think it's really deniable. And as far as American personnel, like with many of the Western weapon systems, there has been Western personnel operating them in a very deniable fashion. Of course, if ever pressed, the U.S. would deny it, the U.K. would deny it, and this has just been a fact of this war. I mean,
Mhm.
you've had what 20,000 Polish quote unquote volunteers fighting on the front lines. That was the estimate at one point. Uh, how many Americans? Who knows? Plenty of French foreign fighters, as we saw. I believe that was also in Kharkov, and that was the lead up to Macron's saber rattling at the beginning of the year. The Georgians, who ever since their government has taken a much more measured position in general, you've seen the number of
Mhm.
Georgian
Yeah.
volunteers really fall
Yeah.
off. And not that Georgia's part of NATO, but at the time, of course, they were trying to very much force it into NATO. But that isn't unique. I know that there's actually been a handful of Germans just across NATO countries, some Canadians as well. Not even like diaspora, which Canada has plenty of diaspora Ukrainians. Notice how none of them go over to volunteer to fight. That's funny how that works. But I digress with that. I do want to mention one other thing about the front line. This happened, I believe, 2 weeks ago. It was recent, a week, 2 weeks ago. And that is Marina Bezaglaya, who is another member of the Rada, who has been very vocal about the situation on the front line and very vocal about Ukraine's prospect. In fact, very sobering takes compared to what you hear in the Rada or from any Ukrainian officials in general. Was actually on an official visit to the front lines. I think I can't remember where she was. I don't think it was Ugladar, but I think it was near the Pokrovsk direction. It might have been Pokrovsk itself. I'm not sure if she was actually in the city, saying that, well, behind this, there's no defenses set up. There's nothing. This is our last line of defense. And if this falls, then the Russians have license to go all the way up to the Dnieper with little to no resistance. And it's not even like, especially given the past 2 years, anyone who had an ounce of Russian sympathy or an ounce of even just wanting a peace agreement has been purged from the Ukrainian government. So it's not exactly like Bezaglaya is in the pocket of the Russians, despite what some people might say. But I think she was honestly raising the point that why are there not defensive lines set up behind Pokrovsk? Why are there not defensive lines set up beyond our initial 2014 positions? We're just denying reality at this point, and if we don't retreat and dig in even further, this war is certainly going to be lost. And I think anyone uh, who is rationally assessing this has realized that Ukraine does not have a winning prospect here, and that the most reasonable
Mhm.
thing they can do, and what they should have done, frankly, after the success of 2022, was dig in, reinforce, build layered defenses like we've seen on the Russian side, and just try to exhaust the oncoming Russian forces. Because that was realistically the only chance for Ukrainian victory, that they would have to concede that a significant amount of their territory, about 20, and frankly, we're probably actually getting up to 25% if the current gains continue looking into the near future, that they're just going to have to accept that land is going to be under Russian occupation for the foreseeable future. And the only thing they can do is layer to their defenses and hope they can exhaust the Russians first. But
Yeah, yeah.
what they've done since is counteroffensives, as we've seen. We saw that in 2023. We've seen the refusal to retreat from cities. And once again, going back, a lot of it is political consideration, both within Kiev, of course, also within Washington, London, Brussels, etc. And that has completely hampered whatever war effort has been there. Because looking at the Ukrainian military in 2022, the AFU in 2022, we're talking about a country that has had 8 years of NATO funding, NATO training, and NATO armament. It was nothing to sneeze at. And depending on what you assign the initial Russian goals as with the initial incursions into Ukraine in early 2022, you could say the Russians went in with too small of a force, depending on what argument you want to
Mm-hmm.
make there. But point being is, given Ukraine's size, given its manpower, given its resources, and given its foreign support, and I'm not saying they would have necessarily even won this war or beaten back the Russians, but this should have been a much more difficult fight for the Russians than it has been so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's not to
And
say
that's
it's
not,
been
yeah,
easy.
that's not to downplay how hard fought this war has, but
This is Russia's bloodiest war since World War II.
yes, yes,
I
I
mean, there's estimates like somewhere between 65 to 85,000 dead for sure.
yeah, and
Um,
I was
uh,
actually going to get into casualty numbers in a little bit here, but just to amend
okay.
my previous statement, that's not to say that this has been an easy campaign for the Russians at all, but I'm just saying it has. I would have expected this to be a lot bloodier than it was.
I see.
Especially after the initial phase of the war, after things got bogged down. Because I know, and I think a lot of people were guilty of it. I did downplay Ukrainian strengths. What I did downplay, I should clarify, was Ukrainian morale. Because yes, they have been supported by NATO since 2014, but I thought when the bombs actually started falling that Ukrainian morale, given the political and ethnic situation in the country, would not hold in the face of a Russian invasion. And I was completely wrong about that. I will admit that.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I don't have really much else to add.
Yeah, I was just got off on a little bit of a tangent there. But let's see. I do have a few news items out of Europe. If you don't have anything out coming out of Ukraine, any last minute stories?
Yeah, that's about it. Like, I think I covered sort of some of the grueling aspects of the war, the sort of the W's and L's for both side, and just to give an idea of how gruesome the fighting still is in these places. I know the front line keeps moving, but there's costs on both sides, and I think the hits on the trains and the train stations. That's right. One of them was in Mykolaiv. That was where you saw, but it was not the only train that was hit. There was another one hit that in the western part of the Donetsk region.
And that also
But
goes along with the trends that at least the Russians have been reporting, and you have to question how much of this is them spinning a narrative versus how much of this is actually happening, where pro-Russian partisans within Ukrainian territory have been sabotaging rail networks as well in places like Odessa and Nikolaev.
hmm hmm
I mean, I don't discount the possibility of Russian sympathetic elements, especially within that part of the country. But I would need to see more concrete proof towards that. Like I said, I'm not denying it outright. But yes, the strikes on Ukrainian logistics have definitely ramped up. And going back, what was it, about a month ago now, the strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. And you do have to wonder, depending on how Russia wants to approach this war, and a lot of this is in the lead up to the BRICS summit, which is going to be in about 3 weeks, I believe, in Kazan, Russia. So there are a lot of political considerations being taken into account right now when it comes to Russia's conduct of the war effort. And once pen is put to paper on BRICS on a lot of agreements at the summit, I can imagine the Russians are probably going to ramp up their war effort end of October into November. And depending on how much stock they put in the domestic political situation in the United States, which I can say the Russians have probably largely written off, but not entirely, we might see increased Russian offensives in November and increased Russian activity in November in the lead up to the election, uh, just for the sake of getting egg on the face of Ukraine's main sponsor.
Yeah.
But with that being said, the last point I want to touch on Ukraine is I don't know
Hmm.
if you got a chance to see it yet, but History Legends did put out a new video as of today, and I recommend once again, as always, watch it. It's like it's one of his longer ones, it's like 42 minutes, and goes over the situation on the front line. But what I found more interesting about that was there was a lot of number crunching about Russian losses within 2024, the first half of 2024, and his final figures based on his estimation of irrecoverable losses. We're talking those who have been killed and those who have been injured to the point where they cannot return to the front lines for the first half of 2022 has been roughly, I think the figure he gave was 50,000 on the Russian side, and then to that same figure, about I think his final total was about 30,000 on the Ukrainian side. Like I said, just for the first half of this year alone, and this isn't including the rest of the war. And there are other estimates out there, of course, but he was also going over, which I thought was not to downplay the loss of life and the ruination of lives here, the recruitment numbers that the Russians and the Ukrainians are able to crank out, and that given Russia's recruitment campaigns, whether that be through financial incentive, whether that be through the partial mobilization they did back in 2022, and just other programs that they have created in order to boost recruitment, the Russians, between irrecoverable losses and recruitments, are netting about 77,000 troops, whereas the Ukrainians were netting about 6,500. Like I said, these are all estimates. These are all numbers. If you want more of a breakdown of it, of course,
So who was this again?
this was from History Legends.
Oh,
This
really?
this was the second half of his newest video, which I like a lot of number
Okay.
crunching. I thought was interesting. Of course, um, if anyone has the due diligence for me to believe those numbers, it's someone like him. So, like
Hmm.
as always, recommend checking it out. It should give
Oh, I think I saw this. This is from a week ago or more, right?
that might be a different one, but I think this one came out
Hmm.
today, or maybe I just
He
missed it.
did. He has done. He did a previous video like a few weeks ago that had like the numbers.
I think it's not to get too far on this
Hmm.
topic conversation, but just something that's pretty routine. Like every few videos, we'll get into just number crunching on that.
Oh, that's right. I didn't see it, but the title was something like "The Attrition War."
Yes, and like I said, once again, I recommend everyone check it out, and I think it'll give a broader perspective of what the numbers actually look like. And I can't recall these off the top of my head, but he went over the armored vehicles, the artillery losses from the Ukrainian side as well, which, yeah, it's. I'm inclined to believe the numbers more than I am to disbelieve them, and if
Hmm.
assuming they're even half of what he says, which I think is which I think is fair, and probably even more than that, then it's staggering for the Ukrainians, and I don't see what their path forward is. Once again, talking about on their last line of defense in the Donbass, the 2014 lines are collapsing. Unless they have some ace up their sleeve, unless they have some rapid deployment of trench diggers in, I don't know, the next couple months here, which, looking at the rapid deployment of fortification builders in Pokrovsk, they were tasked with planting flowers. So I
Yeah.
think that should tell you the situation right now on the most vital points of the front line in Ukraine. But that's all I had for Ukrainian news. If you have anything else, certainly. If
I
not,
don't. I really don't have anything else at the moment, Tad. Like there always is something. I just
yes, and
can't right
I'm sure
now.
we'll remember 3 hours later when we're at the end of the show.
Yeah, as always.
But just to touch on some brief European news, you do have the Austrian elections where the FPO, which is the quote unquote right wing populist party, did win the elections. They were the largest share. And right now, it's just a dispute over the coalitions. And now, what is interesting, you're getting a situation similar to Slovakia, where the populist left wing party has agreed to enter dialogue about a coalition so long as the FPO doesn't hold the position of chancellor. Of course, they'll hold other cabinet positions, they'll have a great amount of influence in the government. But much like what you saw in Slovakia with Fico, because Fico's party affiliation wise, he's a social democrat. I think a lot of people forget that, in coalition with the right wing populist parties in Slovakia. So you are seeing this pattern spread into Austria, where you're getting the populist left right coalitions once again. And we'll see if government actually comes from that, or whether the center, whether the liberals are able to form a Frankenstein coalition and deny the populist party's power, like they did in France, like they're doing on the state level in Germany, which some of the state level elections in Germany, the AfD has been doing very well. And we're less than a year out from the next German federal election, so we'll see what those look like when that happens. But I would say more importantly within the European news, but the two do tie together, is Orban is launching his own peace initiative to go along with, or I suppose in opposition to the Zelensky wish list. In which case, he has actually reached out to both the Chinese and the Brazilians, reached an understanding there where he's going to participate, probably the only European voice within any sort of peace negotiations. But there were also hints from the French that they might want to get involved. Macron is flip flopping again. He is trying to play the middleman as always. Now, I doubt that'll last, but he does seem to be hinting at a more conciliatory view on the issue.
Mhm.
And like I said, especially with the proposals coming out of China and Brazil, this is all in the lead up to the BRIC summit. And I think when it comes to talking about either China or Brazil, or even India for that matter, we're not going to really see any of their true intentions, or we're not going to have a clear picture of what their plans are for this or really anything on the global stage until the BRIC summit is concluded and we see the agreements made there or lack thereof. Uh, so, like I said, I think that is October 21st. I could be wrong, but I know it's the towards the end of this month where they will all be meeting with, of course, discussions about new members, potential members, and states that want to join, which we've all seen the massive expansion of countries, and not just small countries, not just these insignificant countries. They're not great powers, but they are pivotal countries like Turkey, like Iran, like Saudi Arabia, who want to get into BRICS, countries that have resources, that have strategic geography. These real middleman powers of the world are wanting to align themselves with this new power block, especially economically speaking. So there's going to be a lot on the table there, and there's only so much you can say until the discussions actually formally start. But the last piece of European news I have before we get into some of the Middle Eastern stuff is that former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte is now the
Yes.
Secretary General of NATO as of today. We're recording today on October 1st, 2024. Stoltenberg left. He gave his very mushy final remarks talking about how much he loved the position and don't be afraid of Russia and we should pursue Ukraine and the NATO, pretty much as his departing statements. But he was also a little schizophrenic and maybe showing a direction of things to come, saying, "Well, don't be afraid of dialogue with the Russians either." In which case, we all know by dialogue it means the dictation of demands.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
Rutte coming in, even during his tenure as prime minister in the Netherlands, was always one of the very pro NATO voices. Frankly, he resembled somebody from Poland or the Balkans when it came to it, when it came to some of his rhetoric, especially his rhetoric about Russia. Very much wanting to lead the charge on this Atlanticist crusade, for lack of a better word. And he's in charge of NATO now. Now, once again, of course, the Secretary General represents the organization. They set policy objectives, whatever. But in terms of, say, like NATO admission, I don't think I really need to reiterate this, but I will just for the sake of it. Ukraine's not getting in. The, number one,
Yeah,
they
no
number one, they've
kidding.
had to get past Turkey and Hungary. Germany's balking. The United States has no interest in it. Pretty much the only countries that have interest in getting Ukraine to NATO once again are Poland and the Baltics. And I don't know, maybe there's a few other stragglers in Eastern and Central Europe. I don't know, maybe the Czechs, but even the Czechs are having their own, I guess, say populist revolt. Where I think that one is the um, APB. I can't remember the acronym, but point being is the right wing populists have been winning local elections in the Czech Republic as well, and uh, I don't know. I don't know how much longer Pavel is in office for, but even
Hmm.
Pavel has been toning down his rhetoric when it comes to support for Ukraine and talking about how they might have to accept some degree of Russian occupation for some time. And he's even trying to wind that down. He's been one of the more fervent voices on Ukraine. So when all the hawks start getting quiet and the main voices you have are, like I said, Poles and Balts, and I don't know, maybe a few people in the UK who are especially vocal about the issue. I know Boris Johnson is still trying to retain some relevance, and he'll come out and bloviate about this sometimes. It doesn't look good when it comes to Western support for Ukraine when all of this is faltering. I mean, even Kamala Harris is supposed to be this, continuing on the Biden legacy, this continuing on of the Democratic Party tradition. I'm not saying that they've snubbed Ukraine by any means. Of course, she met with Zelensky as well as Trump did, but it's become very much a secondary priority, even from a foreign policy perspective. Very much a secondary priority, and hell, now that we have this outbreak in the Middle East, Ukraine's going to be the last thing on Trump's mind. So either way,
Mm.
they're not in a comfortable position unless, I don't know, they can false flag it to make it look like Russia blew up the Zaporozhye power plant, like they've tried to do 5 times already. But barring some sort of major event like that, they're simply not going to be able to press the issue anymore.
Right. We should also mention, I know this is a bit of a side note, but given this, how 2024 has become kind of like the year of trying to kill, let's say, right wing or right wing slash populist candidates or, presidents or former presidents. You remember back in May, they nearly killed Fico. Uh, I mean, he had at least 4 bullet wounds, somehow survived. And it was some crazy left-wing boomer that they arrested. But this past week, he received, or it might have been yesterday, he received a bullet inside a letter as a kind of threat, like, we're not stopping till we kill you, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it has to be some stupid CIA op, right? Like, I mean,
Or whoever they outsourced it
it's
to.
not like they
Yeah,
just want to kill Blumph. Like,
yeah, and that's also on top of, I know I had mentioned this a couple times before, the alleged plan to car bomb Orban 2 days before he went to Moscow. That Hungarian intelligence agents say that they busted audio tapes of Ukrainians talking about it. And like I said, that's probably not even if you had some, I don't know, hardliner Ukrainians who fled into Hungary at the outbreak of the war. They probably weren't doing it of their own volition. Well, I shouldn't say of their own volition, but they probably weren't doing it independently, and that they had some sort of backer behind them, even if it was just sort of a, I don't know, 93 World Trade Center situation where they just gave them a bag of flour and said this is explosives.
mm,
But yeah, this trend is picking up, and like I said, there's been 2 attempts on Trump so far. We had Fico, we had this little letter stunt, possibly Orban, and I don't know if you want to count this, but Budanov, who we should mention actually is allegedly going to be dismissed within the next few days. I'll believe it when I see it.
yeah, I read that too.
Um, Yet they're called that he was actually plotting the assassination of Putin back in, I believe it was July as well.
Mhm.
But I
Yes.
mean, I think that one's a bit of an outlier because that's just what you expect from somebody like Budanov. But point
Right.
being is, they have made that more of a, I guess to say, quote unquote, acceptable option. It's something that in their toolbox that they are far more willing to use as compared to, say, previous years. Because
Hmm.
I mean, and like I said, I know this is an independent case as it is, but the real trend when I started to see these political assassinations happens, and they've been few and far between, but it seems like Shinzo Abe in Japan, right? Even after he retired, when you had the assassin with the contraption shotgun who took him out, seemed to really kick this off. And that was about 2 years ago. And then, of course, you had the attempts against Fico, then Trump, then possibly Orban, then Trump again. So yeah, it's getting weird, especially when you look at the second attempt on Trump. The first one is the one where they actually did hit him and didn't catch him beforehand. That's a weird situation in itself. But the comparison of Fico and the second Trump attempted assassin, like I said, those guys were almost identical in terms of what they believed, how they carried themselves. It was insane. It was like it's like he was a
Hmm.
clone of the guy, and I don't think we're out of the woods with those. And I think this is
Oh
going to
yeah,
continue, especially for these lower level guys, especially for these guys like Fizzo and for Orban. And like I said, now that we've seen some so-called populist right success in Austria, I could see I don't know somebody trying to do something there, or against some of these other upstart populist movements across Europe as well. And that I know that of course they all just despise Trump, even though he would probably acquiesce to them under enough pressure. But I do think that they're going to start looking at these smaller figures and are going to start taking out their rage and implementing their more, let's just say, unhinged agendas against those kind of people.
yeah. Um, I mean, I also look at this as a kind of a breakdown. I wonder, like, what is, um, I mean, what are the real reasons they would want to get rid of Budanov unless it's like, um, some kind of vying for power, right? Like, I think Budanov in Ukraine is actually extremely popular, you know?
Yes,
Um,
and I don't know. Maybe it's just a misinterpretation of the coming up shuffle where they're going to put him in a different position because right now he's head of military intelligence, but they could be. It could be much like how they reported the Shoigu situation, where it made it seem like Shoigu was dismissed, but he was actually moved to the Security Council. I'm not saying it's going to be a one for one comparison to that, but it could just be outsiders misinterpreting a potential cabinet shuffle, and that Budanov could be moved into a different position because I
yes,
think he's too
yes.
valuable of an asset for even Zelensky to get rid of.
Yeah, this is what I mean. Like, I'm not saying they didn't have differences or that, and as far as I know, w- I don't know if there were any great disagreements either between him and Siersky or him and Zaluzhny. I mean, legend has it, how he got his start. So he was a, a resident of Crimea, and he was doing, DRG, like, reconnaissance missions, sabotage. He was in a sabotage group that got wiped out. He managed to survive, and he swam for like something like, I don't know, 40 miles. Or like, looking at him, you could never think he could do this. Like, he must have been in so much better shape 6 years ago. And, you know, so what I'm saying is this: he's a fanatic, right? Like, he's a Yuki from Crimea. Like, can you imagine, like, being from Crimea and like the kind of resentment you would have to have towards Russians,
Yeah, the
and
5% of
knowing full
guys
well, like,
who
it
didn't
was
want
it
the
was it
annexation.
was settled by Russians,
Yeah,
right? So
but you're right that just being a minority within Crimea, the fraction of people who actually didn't want the Russians there. Yeah, I can imagine what somebody like that would be. That, and as far as I know, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Unlike Zaluzhny, he's not part of Poroshenko's candy bar cabal. But so there's no internal
yeah.
power struggle because that's been the big concern, especially when Zaluzhny went to the UK, went from the UK with Keir Starmer to his meeting with Zelensky.
Hmm.
That they were planning some sort of power shuffle, and that they were trying to get the candy bar cabal back into power. Also,
Candy
I
bar.
did not have that planned out. I just came up with that on the spot. I do have to
I
say,
love it.
but yeah, the candy bar cabal and the comedian cabal, the two warring factions for control of Ukraine. Who will win? I can tell you the Ukrainian people will lose, but either way.
Yeah.
Um, I think any talk, in all seriousness, of Zelensky's departure is a bit premature. I think we're going to have to get the U.S. elections out of the way. I think we're going to have to see probably some much more catastrophic failures in the front line, which, looking at the trend of things, are inevitably going to be happening within the next few months here, before they finally call it quits and try to hold some sort of quote unquote election or just demand the dismissal of Zelensky if they, speaking of assassinations, don't outright try to take him out.
hmm Yeah, there must be something. There must be something going on, and we don't know the full story. It could even be something that he's wanted. He is wanting to leave. Um,
Oh yeah, he has his
uh,
golden parachute. He just needs to decide when to deploy it.
yeah, I mean, it could just be that you know he's going to be doing more of the same thing, but I don't know. He'll be part of a government in exile, or he'll be working more closely with you know with the CIA. That's what I
Yeah, he can
imagine.
go around giving talks for the National Endowment for Democracy.
Yeah, the guy knows democracy, let me tell you.
Oh, and the best part about that is he barely speaks English, so those speeches would just be a riot.
Yeah,
Yeah, that would just be amazing.
and he always looks extremely unimpressed. He looks always very, very unimpressed. Very unimpressed.
Yeah, but trust me, unless there are, let's just say, more hardline factions in Ukraine who want him in the ground, he's going to have his golden parachute, and he's going to live very well for the rest of his days,
Yeah, yeah, he will.
regardless of what happens. Like I said, he will suffer no consequences for overseeing the destruction of Ukraine. Mind you, this is somebody who campaigned on a referendum in Lugansk and Donetsk, and campaigned on trying to restore relations with the Russians. Because at the time he was aligned with Kolomoisky, and Kolomoisky was concerned about his business interests, so he was trying to actually have some sort of breakthrough with the Russians. But he is the one who delivered Ukraine into the state that it is today.
Mm.
And like I said, you can go back to 2019. You can actually listen to our shows from 2019. I think it's a bit of a stretch to say we supported him, but let's just say we preferred him over Poroshenko by far. And we thought there was some real opportunity back then that there might
Yes.
actually be some diplomatic breakthroughs, that he might be malleable enough to enter into some sort of dialogue. And
I,
I thought that was possibly the case, and that may have been the case. It may have just been that
I
the
think
West
so.
the West jumped on it first, and they sweetened the pot too much, and the Russians maybe they slept on the issue. Maybe Zelensky could have been a great negotiating partner had the Russians were a bit more active about that. Had they uh, taken a little bit more action sooner, who knows?
hmm hmm Yeah, I mean it's possible. The Russians, like there's some really crazy stories, right? So they didn't invest very much. Like they years before they went back in 2022, they had actually pulled out some of their agents as a show of goodwill. Like what that basically says to the Ukrainians is the Russians are coming from a point of weakness. They don't want to settle this. Let's say with the war, they're not really serious. Blah blah blah. Um, let's just go for it, right? And they kind of suckered in the Russians every time, right? The Russians kept trusting, kept trusting. They I honestly think Putin could not imagine like bombing the smithereens out of Ukraine. It might be a bitter pill for some people, but he probably thinks like Kiev and the rest of Ukraine, like Odessa and Dnipropetrovsk and all that are more are like more important and have such a rich history than Donetsk City and whatnot because they're so industrial and because they were developed later. That I mean, Odessa's fairly new as well, but it's a
Yes,
gem of a city, right? Kind of it's special it's special in ways of its own. So I just think he couldn't comprehend doing something like this, and now it cost him a lot. Um,
and
it cost him a lot of soldiers,
I
that's
do
for sure.
think another issue with Putin in that regard is that he is a tried and true believer of that Soviet mindset, brotherhood of the peoples, where Ukraine could be an independent nation and they could be neutral, but because of the historical and cultural ties, they will just tend towards the Russians, and that we don't need to integrate them. We don't need to annex them. We don't need to exert any further political pressures. It's just that we still have those historical and cultural bonds, and we can be two friendly states. And I think that was one of his other pitfalls. And you look at his political philosophy. You look at a lot of what he says, and maybe I have a bit of a misreading on that, perhaps. But I do think for the past 20 years that was his approach, and he did not act until he felt he was absolutely forced to, after all negotiations, both the Ukrainians and the West had failed. And I know that we've been critical that people say, oh, he should have gone in and done all this in 2014 because Russia simply was not economically prepared for that. They would have been crushed under the sanctions if that was the case. But
Most likely.
I still do think that on the Russian part there was a lack of preparation because of the. I don't want to say simply
He was
because.
unprepared in 2022.
Yes.
Like that doesn't mean like one is wrong to presume that he was um you know like him being unprepared in 2014 is not the same thing as him being unprepared in 2022. He was
Yeah,
unprepared
I
both
agree.
times, but in the wrong way, in different ways.
And I would say, looking back at the early points of 2022, it does feel with the actions that were taken as if he felt his hand was forced to do so. Not that he
Yes,
was,
absolutely.
not that this was premeditated. It was a, it was a plan B, as it were. This is something he did not want to do, but had it in his back pocket, and was forced to deploy it when tensions were rising in Ukraine. And we saw this build up back in April 2021, back in November 2021, which ultimately culminated in this. But I don't think, and frankly, you can go back and listen once again to our older episodes. I don't think he thought that the Ukrainians would actually try to make a move on Donetsk and Luhansk, but they did. Uh, they got
I
the.
mean, not in a big way. I think he thought like Ukraine. You can see why Zelensky was so pivotal, right? Because it was a trap that Putin fell for. Uh, he must have been waiting for somebody other than Poroshenko. The people don't want this. This would be such a tragic mistake. It would be unprecedented in our history, like all that stuff, you know. And because I understand it, because the church I go to is a mixture of Ukrainians and Russians, and I'll tell you off here. I got very mad this weekend, but um, so I think he really believed it. There was a kind of taking advantage of the naivete, right? Presuming your enemy is as human as you are, and we'll get into it, and we should probably get into it soon. That applies between the war between Israel, America, and Iran. So
Well, that being said,
Israel and America versus Iran, let's say.
yes. And that being said, I think that we've exhausted most of what could be discussed about Ukraine,
Yeah.
for the time being at least. I'm sure we'll be back with more news. More will happen on that front. But moving on to the Middle East, to give you a brief overview of what happened in the past 2 weeks since we last did our episode, we did discuss the pager attacks and the implications of those. But since then, Israeli strikes on southern Lebanon have only increased. And those culminated over this weekend and into the beginning of this week in the at first suspected and then confirmed assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, who was the head of Hezbollah since 1992, since the assassination of the previous head of Hezbollah. Now, his name escapes me, but his successor is his son-in-law, and that is who is
Yeah.
currently in charge of Hezbollah. And in the lead up to this, you did see strikes on not only him, but several of his lieutenants as well. And it did look as if there was a major security breach in Hezbollah to the point where the Israelis were able to take them out. Now, I will present, not saying I necessarily strongly believe in it, I will present a bit of a counter argument. When you bomb everything in southern Lebanon, you're bound to hit them eventually. It's just the way it is. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't any sort of security failure, but given the size and scope of this operation, in retrospect, it's not surprising that if they were in the area, then they did not have a very high likelihood of surviving, especially given the locations. But in response, you did have the Hezbollah firing their salvos of missiles back into Israel. And they did manage to hit some of the air bases in northern Israel. They were able to hit other military targets within northern Israel as well. But also, I mean, it has been a strange situation where it does seem like the Houthis have been more successful with their missile strikes into Israel than Hezbollah has. Now I know it's a longer distance. The air defense network coming in from the south is probably less developed than say it is on the northern flank, so it's not really one-to-one comparison. But I do think it's interesting nonetheless that you have had the Houthis able to land these missiles right in the middle of Tel Aviv. But
Well,
go ahead.
I mean the videos that I saw today, like so today I had a very busy day, and it's, as you know, it's been a very busy week. I don't want to get into it, but one of the reasons we couldn't have the show as soon as we could is because it's been a death in our family and our extended family, and so anyway, so I haven't had a chance to see some of these videos, and the videos that I saw of the Iranian strikes on Israel are incredible. I mean, dozens and dozens of impacts, dozens. There are reels where you will see a half a dozen to a dozen strikes, and then you'll see another video like that and another video like that, right? Like, yeah, some of them hit open areas. Some of them probably, I mean, I've seen some hit downtown Tel Aviv, right? You know, Iran, Hezbollah, they don't have planes. They're not going to drop bombs. They have, eh, you know, missiles, intercontinental. Well, I wouldn't say intercontinental, but these are long range
Medium range
missiles,
missiles, long range
medium
missiles.
range, several hundreds of miles.
But I will say on that regard, when it comes to Israel's air defenses, a lot of people are questioning about the Iron Dome. Now, mind you, the Iron Dome was built to intercept the kind of rockets that Hamas and Hezbollah fire off. What actually failed today, because there was a just complete failure of air defense, as will happen when you overwhelm them, that there's just simply too much for them to keep up with. The systems that they managed to overpower today were David Sling, which of course they always have to pretend like they have any claim to the Old Testament these days. But I'm not going to get into that topic again. You all know where I stand on that when it comes to questions like that. But of course they have the LARPy names like David Sling, which would be a cool name for a weapon for any other country. I'll just put it that way. But I digress. Um, and more importantly, Patriot batteries that they had. They still employ U.S. Patriot batteries as well, and both of those were unable to intercept some of these heavier long range and medium range missiles as well. And they were able to land on their targets. Once again, those managed to hit airfields, they managed to hit military targets, some that hit open areas. Uh, and with that, the Jordanians did try to shoot a few of them down. Now, if you want an allegory of what a relationship with Israel is like for any country, the Jordanians managed to down one Iranian missile which landed and killed a Jordanian civilian. If you want the perfect
Yeah,
allegory for what your relationship with Israel is going to be as any country, that's what it is right there. You do them a solid, and no good deed goes unpunished. Look, I know they aren't directly responsible for it, but I mean, the Jordanians have no outstanding issues with the Iranians as it is. They didn't have to shoot down that missile, and in the end, it only cost them both money and in this case, a life.
yeah.
So
I personally believe there were far more casualties. Now, the Iranians, there's no way to verify this, and it could be complete BS. They're claiming they destroyed nearly 20 F-35s. I saw the videos that hit close to the Air Force. I mean, Israel is a very small country, like Lebanon, so hitting is, I guess, eventually going to hit because there isn't that much space between various cities and military installations. But um, I tend to think that the Israelis had a kind of a media blackout. Of course, they don't want more Israelis leaving Israel. It's also kind of funny because I saw videos yesterday where Israelis, mostly women, were jumping up and down, in jubilation that their forces were going to invade Lebanon.
Oh, of
And
course.
it's kind of funny that this attack happened. Um, Everybody, for weeks, like I get it, like it's fair to say that both Iran and Hezbollah have under have underperformed, particularly with like intelligence and intelligence leaks. I mean, they're completely infiltrated.
Oh yeah, that's completely fair to say, and I do think that some of it did have to do with complacency. That they did win the 2006 war. They did see great success in Syria over the course of the Syrian civil war, and that the leadership got too comfortable in its position. They got too confident about that and just assumed security was better than what it was. And the Israelis were actually able to exercise some patience and some restraint and were able to build these infiltration networks where normally you would assume, perhaps I don't give the Mossad enough credit, that they would act prematurely, that they would expose themselves, that they would think now is the opportune time for a strike and try to act against, say, top Hezbollah officials or top IRGC officials too soon. But they actually did bide their time. They were able to create these infiltration networks. One of the more embarrassing stories is that the head of the counterintelligence unit, particularly targeted to root out Mossad agents in Iran, was outed himself as a Mossad agent. And
Right, right. And I find it interesting that it was this to me looked like an older. If could I be wrong? I mean, I could be wrong about this, but it looked like an older story that Ahmadinejad might have already said, or is that because they used photos like in one of the Telegram posts, he's wearing a mask? That seems like it's 2020. Is that when he said it, or they just couldn't find recent photos of him? Are his statements new? Are they based on what happened after the assassination of Hanania?
now I
Like
could be
which?
wrong, but I think it's that that particular task force was started in around 2020 and then got
Mm,
outed recently.
right, right. Well, you saw this during the Cold War, where they had both the Americans and the Soviets both had, you know, directors very high up who had been, working for the other side for decades. So it does happen. Um, and it happened to Iran in a very bad way. That's why Hanania was assassinated. So they had very good intelligence. The the pagers and the walkie-talkies, of course, the Israelis, um,
Yeah, that was a 15-year operation going all the way back to
15-year
2009.
operation, 15-year operation. That's how long they waited for this. Yeah, that's where as you said, the complacency comes in, right? And in a way, they still didn't learn their lesson. Hassan might still be alive. Word has it that he was meeting with some of his lieutenants, right? It's still in Beirut. Like, I can see maybe he's doing that before the pager attacks, but after the pager attacks, he's still willing to do this. Did he think it would just stop at the pager attacks, right? Like, obviously, somebody outed him, or as you say, it's a small area, but they dropped. I heard, okay, over 80 2,000-pound bombs onto this um, high-rise complex. 6 buildings went down, but you can see that one of them, it was entirely focused. I mean, this crater is over 40 feet deep and it just keeps going. And his body was exhumed out of it. It was just from the impact. It's not like his limbs were torn apart. It was just the force of the impact. So they just constantly kept dropping the bombs until they thought, and then 80 bombs. These are like bunker buster bombs. These are not small bombs. There was like literally nothing left of the building. There was only a hole in the earth. It was incredible to see. So yeah, huge failures. Um, like in many ways, Hezbollah played it right initially, and Israel just couldn't tolerate um, Hezbollah constantly launch. I mean, in one of the settlements on the border, Hezbollah has destroyed 75% of the houses. So, the whole point was to put enough pressure for the Israelis to stop bombing civilians in Gaza, right? Was to make a deal happen. And then a deal was assured to the Iranians
Yeah,
by
Pasheshkin
the
even came out and
Americans.
said that, and he was like, "Oh, they duped me. I should have known better than to believe him, given the negotiation history between the United States and Iran, especially
Yeah.
post Iran deal. I don't know how was he that much of an idealist? Did he really think, or was there something in it for him personally? And to the
Yeah.
point where it was actually uh, Khomeini who ordered the attacks today, who ordered the missile strikes today, and now, given the
Oh,
structure,
really?
yeah, just given the structure of Iranian politics, command of the military is under the purview of the supreme leader, and the president is delegated to more domestic authorities. Now, that's not to say the president doesn't have any sort of international role to play, but these strikes were ordered by the supreme leader. They were ordered by Khomeini, or Khamenei, I should say, not Khomeini, but and they were carried out as we saw. I agree with you that there probably was more damage, more casualties than what the Israelis are letting on, and that we will really need to see what happens in the next few days in order to figure out the exact details of that. But he went over his head as he has the right to do, and under the Iranian political system, and had these strikes. And I do agree with what we were talking about off air that first and foremost, it was a show of force. That they weren't looking for the opening salvo in a wider conflict with Israel. Because as it stands now, with the narratives that Iran wants to portray, and with their situation, it does necessitate an Israeli first strike. And they were demonstrating Iranian missile capabilities. But in order for any sort of wider conflict to break out, they would have to let the Israelis hit first. Because otherwise, they're going to incur the full wrath of the U.S., who's probably going to be able to drag in a number of their allies. And although the U.S. is going to unequivocally side with Israel, we all know that they're going to have, let's just say, far less maneuverability if the Israelis struck first, because they're going to have less justification for it. It's going to be, just pragmatically speaking, a harder operation to pull off. And I do think the only reason the Iranians ended up doing the strike today, the only reason that they did end up firing this, because I think they would have waited longer. I think they would have sat it out and waited longer if the Israelis did not announce the operation to invade Lebanon. At that point, especially after that, after the pager attacks and after the assassination of several high-ranking members of Hezbollah, including Nasrallah himself, the Iranians simply had no choice but to respond in order to shore up the confidence of their allies in the region. Because at that point, I'm sure you've all heard the reports. Tensions between the IRGC and the Houthis, tensions between the IRGC and Hezbollah have been increasing. The meetings have been more strained between them in recent months. And at a certain point, and like I said, Pezeshkian didn't order these strikes, and Pezeshkian wanted to paint himself as a great reformer, wanted to come in. This is what happens when you let a Turk run your country, apparently, and wanted to think he could talk his way out of this, even though the time for that has long passed. I don't relish in that fact. I don't want to see any more people die and then have already died in this conflict, this wider conflict. But after a certain point, your enemy has declared war. There's only one real option you can do, and I'm not saying that they need to fully mobilize and go to a state of total war, but the Iranians have lost face. They have lost much of the confidence of their allies. I would say some more so than others, and have made themselves look far weaker. And look, I know there is some strategic value to looking weak at certain points, and that I'm not going to downplay that. But at a certain point, it just looked like a country that was far too cautious for its own good, and was bearing the brunt of that consequence of that against a much more aggressive nation.
Right.
Now, as for Israel, I do want to return to their perspective on this and why they may have done what they have done, because some people question what is Israel's goal in this entire post October 7th military campaign. And I know there's been a lot of speculation about Netanyahu's personal position that, of course, he needs a war to justify himself staying in power. He needs some sort of crisis to justify himself staying in power, especially as the legal issues mount against him, as his own political actions, as his own power grabs, even before October 7th, were starting to bring pressure down upon him. That he needed something to make himself look like the great defender, something to make himself look like I'm the only one standing in between you and the total destruction of Israel. And he has largely accomplished that. I know that there have been protests against Netanyahu. I know that there has been discontent. But he has managed to maintain his grasp on power for this whole time. And
Mhm.
that's going all the way, once again, the recent bout of violence, the recent conflict post October 7th after the Hamas attacks into Israel, with the incursion into the Gaza Strip, with the operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and with the fighting back and forth with Iran and its proxies, particularly in Syria, but also elsewhere. And what I think, and a lot of people I think have overlooked this, is that Israel's ultimate goal is the same that it was in 1997, is the same that it was 30 years ago, and that is the fulfillment of the Clean Break Memo. Going back to that document, which was produced by dual U.S. Israeli citizens who would later go on to work in Bush's Pentagon, one of the main reasons we got the Iraq War, was a memo that dictated Israel, at that point, we're talking 1996, 1997, had managed to secure something of a peace with Egypt and with Jordan. Those flanks were secured. But to their north, in Lebanon, you still had Hezbollah. You still had, at that point, would have been Hafez al Assad in power in Syria, point being a Syrian government that is on good terms with the Iranians. And you have, at that point, potentially growing Iranian influence. Now, Iran's influence pre Iraq War is nowhere where it was compared to after the Iraq War. So, what the memo dictated is that Israel needs to secure its northern flank by dislodging Hezbollah from Lebanon and by the removal or crippling of the Assad government at that point, once again, Hafez al Assad in Syria. And we saw in 2011, and you can even go back to the WikiLeaks, Hillary Clinton's emails, as I'm sure you've heard so much about. One of them was saying, I think that was actually the correspondence with Jake Sullivan, current National Security Advisor, talking about we need to empower Al Qaeda in Syria in order to weaken the Syrian government for the sake of Israel.
Yeah.
That was one of the most damning ones out there. And then
Yeah. Sullivan.
yeah, that was Sullivan. And then
Yep.
as we saw with this most recent bout, a weakening of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, Syria, I think, has been the main stage for a lot of this, going back to the implementation of the Clean Break Memo. Of course, the Iraq War is probably the centerpiece of that with the U.S. intervention there. The Iran War that they were planning didn't quite pan out. I don't know, maybe if they got John McCain in power, the world would look much different today, and we can all be grateful that whatever you say about Obama, which I could sit here going all day about, and I'll bring up the Iran deal in a minute because I do think this ties back into it. At least we didn't get John McCain, at least in that regard. But a lot of the staging for this was in Syria because you did have the massive amount of support against the Assad government. These various rebel groups, most of which turned out to either be Al Qaeda affiliated or outright grew into ISIS. Israel had no problem supporting any of these in order to weaken the Syrian government, keep it divided, and naturally the support for the Kurds. And the Kurds, both in Iraq and Syria, were very valuable trading partners to get Israel oil, if for those of you who may have
Hmm.
forgotten. But you had the setting the stage for that, and you had from about, I would say, 2018 onwards, once Trump got into power, And this actually goes back to some of the tension that exists between first term Trump and Netanyahu, where Trump didn't want to pursue the issue in Syria further than the couple of strikes that he did. You did have the targeting of IRGC officials, Hezbollah officials, and also other Iranian allies in Syria from 2018 onward. And we saw this, I would say, from 2018 into 2021. You have to recall, actually, one of Biden's first major moves of his presidency was strikes on Iranian allies in Syria. That was in February 2021. Uh, yeah, I think that was February 25th, if the exact date, if I can remember the exact date on that. But that has been the goal leading up to all of this. And then if you want to tie that back into May of 2021, you did have the skirmishes between Israel and Hamas in May of 2021, which ultimately ended in a stalemate. And then you go on into October 7th, you have the most recent Hamas attacks, and we've talked about those to death. I'm not going to rehash those. But you are seeing pretty much all of this, especially Israel's actions in Syria, are more or less in line with the clean break memo has said. And it was prepared by members of the Likud party, and the Likud party has more or less been in power since the 90s. There have been, I don't know, was Sharon Likud or Labor? I can't remember honestly. But point being is they've been a dominant force in Israeli politics for the past 30 years, and you've seen the implementation of those policies in Syria. Um, Once again, to reiterate, you saw the Iraq War, you saw the American actions against Iran, and I do think that Israel's current policy, putting aside Netanyahu's personal interest in him trying to avoid justice and stay in power, is they are at their now or never moment. Support for the U.S. is waning, even just for practical reasons. The Americans don't have the kind of power projection that they used to. They also have a number of other concerns across the world, particularly in Ukraine, which is now waning, but also in the Asia Pacific that they must contend with. You have a stronger Russia and China. You have a bridge that was burnt with Russia. As we all know, Bibi tried to call Putin today and was snubbed, um,
Yes.
which was very entertaining considering how there
Wonderful.
almost used to be a red line between Tel Aviv and Moscow at one point, and that has, like I said, that bridge has been burned. But with this, Israel, whether true or not, does feel backed into a corner, does feel that they have to make their more drastic moves now. And I think what Netanyahu's trying to do right now is fulfill what is set out in the clean break memo and to secure Israel's northern flank, as we saw with since October 7th with the rocket attacks coming in northern Israel, the amount of people who have been either internally or externally displaced. They want to secure that northern flank. They want to have life in northern Israel return to normal. And if not outright regime change in Iran, which I think they definitely do want, they want Iranian influence pushed back, at least out of Syria and Lebanon.
Yeah. Yeah, because they eventually want to go in there.
Yeah, and
I mean, I mean, look, it's kind of funny, right? Israel decided to enter Lebanon for the first time in 1982 and to stay there for nearly 20 years and finally left in 2000. You know, at the beginning it went it seemed to go well, you know, the PLO was basically done, but what had happened was the beginning of Hezbollah. Now, Islamic Jihad has been around a long time, but it's not really well known. And I believe it's connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. But it was those two groups that made all those successful attacks on the Israelis, on Shin Bet, on the French, on the Americans. I mean, you put all those groups together, and we're talking like just those attacks alone killed close to 500 soldiers and intelligence officers for the French and for the Americans and for the Israelis. And hundreds more, of course, Israelis died fighting there. Of course, they were there for 18 years. All to say, though, that like, okay, you got rid of the PLO. Even if you get rid of Hezbollah, will it be a charm this time? Will no Muslim group rise up after Hezbollah is gone? Right? Like I think you could have, unironically, Hezbollah uh, has been degraded. It seems like Now, they still launched missiles. They have been launching missiles back at Israel. Of course, they don't have access to sophisticated missiles, the kind that Israel has. They're better than what they had 10 years ago, but it's still not at the same level.
But they also declared
And
the
of
end of
course,
Hezbollah in '92 as well, when Nasrallah
yeah,
took control. So this is
yes,
nothing new.
yes, that's right. That's right. And, they don't have an air force. Obviously, it would be a lot different to just drop bombs. Uh, in many ways, they're even worse just because of the huge payload, right? Um, so yeah, so I guess what I'm getting at is we're going to find out if Hezbollah can deal the kind of damage that it dealt to them for so many years in Lebanon, and then in 2006, after what Hezbollah did to Israel in 2006 was so stunning, so incredible, that it kind of shocked the world, right? And 5 years later, the whole fake Arab Spring started. Part of it was a reaction because I mean, Israel did the same thing. The enormously heavy bombs destroying entire neighborhoods, hundreds of dead. You can check out Magnum photographer Alex Majoli, his shots from that time in 2006. And another great Italian photojournalist for Magnum. His name escapes me now, but if like, but at the same time, that didn't last very long, and the big persuasive factor was that Hezbollah could destroy Merkava tanks at will, and that really terrified them. They were unprepared for that.
And the question
So,
is, given the planned ground operation, will they be able to replicate the same success on a ground fighting level? Because
mhm,
given what we saw with the pager attacks, with the bombing campaigns over the past, let's just say 3 weeks, they were softening up the target, and they were also breaking command structures in order to conduct a ground operation, as we've seen now as they announced the quote unquote limited ground operation. And even with that disorganization, even with the setbacks, the question remains on a ground to ground level, once Israel penetrates into southern Lebanon, if they still do it at this point, if they don't just call off the operation, will they be able to contend with Hezbollah ground forces? Will Hezbollah ground forces be able to contend with IDF ground forces? And I think that's the $1 million question here, because obviously Israel is going to have air superiority. Obviously, they're going to have fire supremacy over Hezbollah. The most they have beyond foot soldiers is the rockets that we had discussed, and once again, 110,000. How many of those were neutralized in the strikes? How many of their stockpiles were hit? I don't know. But if or when Israel actually goes in, how much damage is Hezbollah going to be able to do on a ground-to-ground level, fighting out in the open, fighting
mm,
in urban areas? And that remains to be seen. And also, much like 2006, how much stomach do the Israeli people have for casualties? And I think that's part of the reason why this bombing campaign has been so intense, even compared to previous bombing campaigns, is because they know that the Israeli public, already weary from the war in Gaza, is going to be extremely casualty averse, and that Netanyahu's very fragile support could reach a tipping point if too many body bags come home.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's what it will depend on. But I mean, this year, the last few years have been crazy because I think all sides realize that, right? And yet, no one is stopping. It's almost like the elites of various countries against the elites of another have decided to that this time it's for good. The back and forth has to stop, and there has to be a decisive moment. Um, you could argue and say, well, that's just Netanyahu, you know, but And he's not very popular, but he does have his political party. Let's say those of his political ideology, they will not be rid of. You'll not be rid of them if you get rid of him.
Yeah, as far as I
And
know, Ben Gavir and Smotrich are still relatively popular, especially compared to him.
yeah, and all these people basically they want to right the wrongs of the previous administrations. Gaza shouldn't exist. What's the name of the river? The Elatani or something? The river that the that's in Lebanon.
Yes.
Yeah, the Israelis believe that Lebanon should be theirs too, especially southern Lebanon. Um, so there's a kind of like everybody has maximalist goals, right? Even Zelensky, no matter how much he teases this idea that he's working a peace plan, there is no peace plan. He just
There's a
finds
wish
creative
list.
ways of saying this. It's a wish list. It's a wish list, right? It's always a wish list. It's never interested in the reality on the ground. And so uh there's all everybody has these maximalist goals, and everybody is waiting to see if the other guy blinks first. I mean, as many setbacks as Hezbollah and Iran have had, I think today what we witnessed with so many dozens of impacts, you have hypersonic missiles that are able to maneuver out of the way of Patriot missiles and other missiles, like all that garbage talk from the Americans and from the other Westerners about how great that system is just hilarious. It was always a sham. We knew that in Ukraine, and it's even obvious now in a country like Israel is saturated with these systems. And you can well imagine right now Bibi is on the phone. Yeah, of course, Putin isn't going to speak to him, son of a bitch. But he is phoning Biden. Excuse my language. I hate that man. So he is phoning Biden, and I guarantee you he's asking for Patriot missiles right now. And he's saying, I don't give it, I don't care what happens to Ukraine. Oh, well, Ukrainians hitched their wagon to these guys, so it is what it is. But um, I, it I think now they see what now Ukraine basically has to prepare for the retaliation. But I think the world sees now what Iran is really capable of. I think now they know. And I don't think we've seen even the best of what Iran has to offer, right? And these kind of living conditions for the Israelis will not be tolerable. I mean, the some of the Fatah missiles were used today, and those are the ones that are capable of holding nuclear tips. The other thing is that we should keep in mind is Shoigu. Okay, so Shoigu has missed two security meetings. A few days ago, he was in Iran. I believe he came back, but is he back in Iran again? Right? Like,
Mitushin, the prime minister of Russia, I know is in Iran today.
yes, I know that, but
But
yes,
I think Shoigu has been radio silent for the past couple days, and his whereabouts aren't really known, which
that's
would
right.
which would
So it's
imply something
very
big.
strange.
Um,
Something big, right? And they've been giving the Iranians their missile systems. Again, the Iranians, like the Russians, like Putin, slow to react. A lot of embarrassing moments, a lot of egg on their face. But they don't want to accept that. They're dealing with crazies basically, and time will tell. Time will tell if the Russian air defense system is going to be superior to that of the Israeli and the American air defense systems. Um, we shall see. I mean, generally against ATACMS and stuff, there were two ATACMS attacks in Ukraine over the last 48 hours. They were successfully countered by Russian air defense systems. The stuff that does squeeze through, ironically, in Russia and Ukraine by the Ukrainians are drones. Like it's rarely the missile, it's the drones. Because they have so few metal parts, they're hard to detect. But in any case, right, drones can only cause so much damage, right? And so now we're going to see, now we know, like Ukraine, I keep saying Ukraine. Iran has basically said that, okay, we have escalated. You know, uh, we like no one has hit Israel like this probably for over 50 years, more than 50 years. And, I think Iran knows now that it's real time. And Netanyahu just made a statement that Israel will retaliate. We don't know when, right? So now Israel's been put into the same spot that Iran was in. We'll retaliate, don't you worry. But just when that will be up to us. So it is interesting that this has happened. I guess Nasrallah was the pivotal moment. Maybe the Iranians were working towards it. Like I said, Shoigu has been in and out of Iran several times in the last few weeks and days. Um, and I think even the last show, I said, Iran has to prepare for the Israeli retaliation. But Nasrallah was, I think, the last straw. And now they have to, because Iran's reputation has never been more on the line, and I think they are afraid. Like I think some of their some of their elites are probably afraid that a war right now might mean the end of the Ayatollah. Like I don't know. I don't want to sound like a neocon or like an American or whatever, but you could argue that
Well, I
that
think you bring up an interesting point about that with political stability within Iran. Now, mind you, that they elected Pezeshkian, who
this is
campaigned
what I was
as
going to get
yeah,
to.
who
Yes.
campaigned as a reformer, and I think that was particularly on the social issues going back to the protests of 2022. Which, look, we all know that they glow as bright as the sun, but in order to foment something like that, there has to be popular sentiment in the first place. And I will say, I think a large reason why Iran has remained the way it has for the past 40 years is because of external pressure. Even people who maybe aren't in line with, say, the Ayatollahs or the Islamic Republic see them at least as their countrymen vis-a-vis Israel and the United States, who just want to crater their country, which does leave the possibility of, and some did speculate this, and I actually will go back to something that happened quite a while ago. One of the reasons I think they killed Soleimani is because I think they feared his political career. And because he wasn't necessarily hard line on a lot of the um, Islamic doctrine or like a lot of the base of the Islamic Republic, but he was very much a strongman, very much somebody who wanted to display Iranian strength. And I do think they feared that combination. Somebody who would have been, let's say, less focused on um, the social laws and more focused on projecting strength. And I know
Yes.
Pezeshkian isn't exactly a projecting strength kind of figure, but I do think there is a third way in Iran that may emerge within the next few years, especially depending on how things play out, where it is somebody who's less concerned about, say, the Islamic Republic or the social aspect of it, but is still very much willing to ta- uh, take on Israel and the U.S. or whoever else they call into that fight.
Mhm. Yeah. So now we know. Now Israel now will have to respond. Of course, they're going to continue to bomb Lebanon. Who knows? They might continue to just bomb Lebanon to Beirut and the way they've done Gaza. They would, I think, rather force Hezbollah to enter into Israel than the reverse. But Lebanese troops yesterday, uh, Lebanon isn't going to fight Israel, right?
Even the regular
Uh,
army began abandoning their positions upon Israeli bombing.
yeah, it's first of all, it's not there, and ever since the first Lebanese war with Israel, you had a lot of Maronite Christians that just sided with the Israelis, right? And at that time, Shia Muslims were not on good terms with Sunni Muslims there, and so they kind of just stayed out of it until they uh, uh, were being attacked by the Israelis, and so that it's at that point that they, formed a kind of kinship with the PLO specifically, but also felt like they were in the same struggle, and as a group began reaching out to Iran. So, I would say that the Israelis will probably, let's see. I mean, let's see. They'll go in. The pressure that what Iran will continue rocket attacks for all the times that Israel wastes just bombing Beirut. Of course, it's not a waste because uh, you're setting that country back. It took Lebanon decades to just recover to where it was. It never recovered into the kind of country it used to be in the, like, let's say in the 60s and 70s. um but we'll see where it goes, and we'll see what Iran is Iran able to do more. um there have been some reconnaissance and force that the Israelis have committed to southern Lebanon, right, to take out certain units. But I think Hezbollah wants Israel to enter. They want a quagmire. They're happy to repeat what happened in the 80s and 90s. That is fine with them,
That's the best
right?
thing they could ask for. Lure them into the trap and make them fight
Yeah.
on their terrain. And once again, see how many casualties the IDF can tolerate, see how many casualties the Israeli people can tolerate before they call it quits. And uh, it's a costly solution. I don't think anyone, in terms of human life and what would be lost, would welcome it. But I do think, ultimately, strategically speaking, that is the only way that they see the way out of this. And I do think that, given the way things have aligned, especially with Israeli actions, that's really the only way this is going to end, unless Israel decides to call it the operation and find some sort of weasel way out of it. Uh, which they might, but I do think, once again, the Israelis feel that they're so backed up against the wall, given the past decade at least uh, of conditions in the region and the world turning against them, where they have to take these more desperate actions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the I guess the difference that Israel has going for it now is that it has this enormous casus belli from October the 7th, which it never had before.
Yes, and there's factions in
R-
the West that will back them to the hilt because of that. Uh, and they can even cajole others, countries that would be less likely to, in order to do that. Now, once again, because of their actions in Gaza, they have lost a lot of face. They have burned a lot of that reputation. But when it comes to a lot of power players, it is a card they can pull. It is something they can pull out. They can say, this is to make sure that never again applies to October 7th as well. And the same old PR propaganda campaigns that they always pull out, of course. But
Mm,
but I do want to say on this note, just looking at Israel's position in general, if you look back since the 1973 war, virtually every administration has dedicated the utmost effort into securing some sort of deal that would make Israel a much more stable country in the region, that would neutralize the threats in the region. Going back to the consecutive deals from Nixon, Ford, and Carter, who really brokered quote unquote peace between Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. Uh, Going into the Clinton administration, who certainly were no uh, enemies of Israel, and frankly, the most harsh one since then has actually been Bush Sr., who's been the most critical of Israel. But even as recently as, say, the Obama administration, where I know Likud had a stroke over the Iran deal, but you look at what the Iran deal contained, and you look at what the ultimate American goal for that. I mean, Brzezinski co-wrote this thing.
mm,
Yeah. Oh, okay. They did have concessions that would have eventually let the Iranians develop their nuclear program to the point of being able to build a bomb, and also put no restriction on their missiles. But you look at the finer details of that plan. By the point that they would actually have the capability, the technological capability, to develop a nuclear arsenal, Iran was supposed to be so entangled in the global economy under American leadership that they wouldn't dare. That was the premise of the Iran goal, but it was the maximalists in Israel just could not have it, and of course the neocons in the United States couldn't have it either. Where it was quiet, it was slow. You had to take some loss on the surface of it, but it was a sweetheart deal for Israel that it would have compromised the Iranians. Now, how long would that have worked? Would the Iranians have saw it from their perspective and pulled out? But once again, that was the ultimate goal. Where if it was followed to the letter, if they were able to make the Iranians comply, yeah, uh, it would have neutralized the Iranians at least a far greater extent than they are today, where it would be an afterthought for Israel. And you look at the Abraham Accords that Trump moved mountains to try to implement, trying to get them these big deals with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Like I said, and what does Israel do in all of these circumstances? They look at this and they push the envelope further and they burn whatever goodwill that has been built for them, that they haven't even built,
Hmm.
but has been built for them. And they antagonize these countries. They push their buttons. They push them to the absolute minute, to the moment these deals are scrapped, either by the American side or by their side. And we're back to where we started before, where tensions are at an all-time high. And this is the country that we are expected once again to back unconditionally. The response to the attacks today, the neocons, all the usual suspects, adamant that we move in, that we defend Israel, that we punish the Iranians, and we make sure they're able to punish the Iranians. This country that we have jumped over hurdles for, this country that we have spared no expense for. And once again, you've had every administration since the 1973 war has tried to secure some position for them to the point where they have one less flank to worry about. And what do? They escalate the situation every time, at every opportunity, at every turn.
Yes. Um, yeah, I don't I don't know what else to say. Um, they
And not just the U.S., by the way. Keep in mind, the JCPOA was a multinational agreement bringing in the Russians, the Chinese, uh,
yeah.
the French, and the big five at the UN plus Germany. So it was a comprehensive international agreement in order to save Israel's ass from a future war with Iran. And look at where we are today.
I think in the back of their minds, the niggling problem for Israel is that it understands that it's not an independent country to some extent. Yes, it wags America, and it does so all the time. Like
But they know
when
once
we
they lose that
see,
influence, they're screwed.
right, right, like they still like the mechanisms for their support are something that they still have to formally ask for. It still has to go through that process, and it's visible, right? It's transparent. And I think they understand that there's no sovereignty if they remain like this little country, right? Resources and all kinds of other things would have to be developed, which means that they would have to broaden themselves physically, right? Um, in order to be more independent. They're just too tiny of a state, and they depend on handouts. They got another 8.7 billion. Like they Netanyahu was here not long ago, right? As soon as they step up the escalation, they know they're going to need money, so they get so that, the U.S. politicians give them the money that they need. Um, but ultimately, they know that they're not independent, which is, I think, why some of their co-ethnics in America work so hard to make America into a country that's good for them as Jews. So Um, I don't know how that is ever going to change.
No, no, you're completely
Um,
right. That, yeah, we can talk all day about Israeli influence, but it's the monumental task of both maintaining and expanding that influence in order to secure their position that they otherwise would not be able to hold under any
Yeah.
circumstance. Even with their nuclear weapons, they would not be able to hold that position. Even if they were to annex
Yes.
both the West Bank and Gaza and ethnically cleanse all the Arabs and make it into an entirely Jewish state, they would not be able to hold that position. And also, I think one of the other big factors that people forget about when it comes to the American relationship with Israel and bailing Israel out. I know I touched on this with some of the things I talked about when it came to the American administration's effort to secure Israel's flanks and try to negotiate good deals with their neighbors. Mind you, we give $5 billion a year to Egypt. Now that's not just for the canal, which at this point the Red Sea has been cut off from us with the Houthis, but that is also a very healthy bribe to Egypt to have them stay on, let's just say, decent terms with Israel, not even good terms, but to stay out of war with Israel. Let's just put it that way. That's where a large part
Yeah.
of that $5 billion goes to. And we also give, I don't have the figure off the top of my head, an absurd amount of Jordan for the same reason. Now, Jordan doesn't pose nearly the same threat that Egypt would, but there are bribes paid to the Jordanians, and frankly, probably to the Gulf states as well, in order to have them keep their hands off Israel.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all these countries, in a way, they've been corrupted by the amount of money they're allowed to extort. Well, extort's the wrong word. It's a deal. The Americans
Extract.
wanted it. These extract, yeah, extract is better than extort. But um, yeah. So I don't know. You know, um, yeah. I they they, I mean, a lot of this desperation is BB, I think, understands that America has less sway, right? And maybe you could argue that. Remember back in 2019 and 2020, how there were all these idiots on Twitter talking about how China is just as cringe and gay as America and the West. And look at this popular transvestite or trans woman that has a huge following on their version of Twitter or something of the such. Remember that?
Or
And
the
I
idea
said,
that somehow the diaspora power within the United States is going to try to shift to China because they're the rising power and that they're going to be able to make inroads there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I
But
remember all that talk. And remember, I said, like, if China has to, China will just crush all of this, and it will continue to move closer to Russia. Now, I know lots of right wing Westoids hated hearing that, but most of the people who listen to us don't hate it. Like they're paying attention. So, I said this like 4 or 5 years ago, right? And that's exactly what happened. So I think, okay, this is a roundabout way of getting to my point, but I think Israel maybe back then thought like, we just have to we have to find a place. If things go really bad with America, gradually we can begin moving and influence other countries. Remember all the memes about the Chinese and the Jews are so similar in some ways,
oh
right? Like,
yes,
no, they no that friendship has found a limit, right?
and all the
It has
overtures
limits.
that Netanyahu made to Russia and China only for his successors to burn them down right before he returns to the office. And
Right.
Israel needs another lifeline to call. And as we once again to reference the snubbing by Putin that Putin did not pick up the phone. Uh,
Yeah.
Netanyahu, I guess you could say, just objectively, strategically speaking, to his credit, in the 2010s, he did make those overtures to Russia and China. He did court Chinese economic investment. He was hedging his bets. But then you had Bennett, and then you had whatever his name is, the guy who came after Bennett before Netanyahu came back into power, who burned those bridges. Because I mean, even Bennett was
Yeah.
actually trying to play mediator when Ukraine-Russia war first broke out. He was actually trying to uh, position himself like Turkey was, to the point where he could broker some sort of agreement. And he also didn't stump Chinese agreements. But like I said, his name escapes me. It's killing me right now. But it
Mm.
was him who started to burn those bridges with Russia. And that's actually when you had that TV interview with that unhinged Lakudnik who was saying, after we defeat Hamas and Gaza, we're going to help Ukraine defeat Russia. And he was just going on this unhinged rant on
Oh
RT.
yes, yes, yes. I
Yeah, that
remember.
was,
I remember
and
him.
obviously he
That
wasn't
that
prime minister,
literally
but
that literally happened like the first. like within the first week or first few days of October 7th, like he went nuts. He went nuts. Like, I mean, you know what's ironic about the attack? Like we were preparing to do a show, and it was just going to be about mostly the Ukraine war as usual, right? And you know, I found out that the 13th Israeli Jew the Russians killed in Ukraine, who went there as a volunteer, and then like literally a few hours later, like the story broke. I couldn't fall asleep, and like all
Yeah.
the stuff was coming out
By the way,
about the
it's
attacks.
Yair Lapid who I was trying to think of, who was the one who
Yeah,
really
yeah.
burnt the bridges with Russia. And once again, we're seeing the consequences of that, where the Russians, especially during their intervention in Syria when it was at its height, were very attentive to Israeli concerns. They were very much trying to keep that from boiling over. And they
Hmm.
even were arguably too acquiescent to the Israelis in Syria with the number of strikes they managed to get off. But like I said, any especially going into October 7th when you really wanted those connections with the Russians, with how close they are to the Syrians, the Iranians. Well, thanks to Lapid, those bridges were burned. There was no lifeline to Moscow. There was nothing because I do think a large part of why we've seen the escalation after October 7th is because uh, obviously the U.S. they were going to be unequivocally pro-Israel. They might give their token finger wag about don't go too far with it, but ultimately they were going to be the backer. But if they wanted somebody to actually broker an agreement, they would have needed Russia, they would have needed China, they would have needed a country
Hmm.
with less
Hmm.
stigma in the region who has a known working relationship, especially with the Iranians, where they could have negotiated some sort of third party agreement in order to maybe not solve the situation, but kick the can down the road just 5 more years. But no, those bridges were burned, and Israel. This is what Israel looks like when they don't have the careful international politics, which, to his credit, Netanyahu, before he came back into power, did manage to cultivate. Love him or hate him, which I have no love for him. I have nothing but contempt for the man. He did play his cards smart in the 2010s, and now all of that capital has been burned by both himself and his successors, and this is the situation we find ourselves in today.
Yeah.
But that's all I had, unless you have any last minute stories either about that or anything that we had missed.
Mm, like I say, there always is, but I can't think of it right now.
Okay, and I'm hoping with how rapidly the news has moved in these past couple days, the minute we put this out, it's not out of date. But I will just say, just to bookend the show, there's a very real possibility a lot of what we said may not be valid or may have aged poorly in light of rapidly moving events. But hopefully, you can still gather some value out of this. I think a lot of what we say about Ukraine will hold good at least, but I hope the Middle Eastern news isn't too far out of date within the next, I don't know, 18 hours it takes to get this show up.
Yeah, I mean the last thing I'll say about because these are really the two big stories, you know. Also, it should be said that the Iranians claimed that they told the Americans and the Russians that they would attack. The Americans deny it. The Russians have not said anything. They don't acknowledge or deny. Um, but look, uh, Iran was able to land hits, tonight on Israel. It doesn't matter how successful or unsuccessful they are. The Israelis are not thinking we can afford for this to go on forever. It's okay. In 10 years, they won't advance. No, the Israelis are going to be panicking. They're looking for a full-on war. They know that these missiles, many of them could have had, could, in the future, can have nuclear tips. Um, uh, Israel nuking Iran is probably something that it feels entitled to do, but it doesn't want to be the victim of a nuclear attack. So, what was demonstrated tonight is going to be enough for the Israelis to try to really, really try to get the Americans on board to do something about Iran. That doesn't mean that they're going to invade, but there has been a mission creep in the Middle East. The Americans have brought in, started with 10,000. Now this is closer to 40,000 in the region. It's not all in Israel, but we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Of course, our normal outposts in the Gulf, particularly Kuwait, is
Yeah.
the where we keep a lot of our ground forces.
Yes.
But I do have to wonder, and I say this somewhat tongue in cheek, is I wonder if, as an October surprise, or maybe even after the elections, if the Israelis can drum up one last act of spite out of Biden and get him to commit to some sort of military operation right as he's leaving office.
Oh, for sure they'll try.
Yeah, and I think, given Biden's mental state, and I think given just frankly his personality in general, they might have a reasonable chance of succeeding, especially if Trump wins. Uh, Biden can throw up his hands, say, I don't have to deal with this anymore. I don't care. Have fun, Trump, and here's your Iran war. I think it's a bit of a harder sell if Harris gets in, but I wouldn't put it past Biden's spite or immense Israeli pressures, where at the point where maybe they don't get an outright commitment, but they get some sort of American action that will eventually spiral into a commitment.
Well, I mean, if there's one thing that's obvious, right, is that the Democrats in 2024 are as pro-Israel as the Republicans. I don't think there's a difference. What's his name? Tim Walz apparently made some, during the debate, he had to pledge his allegiance to Israel. I mean,
I mean, even going back to Josh Shapiro, who was in the consideration for Harris's running mate, he tried to volunteer for the IDF, and he is extremely pro-Israel. And although he's just governor of Pennsylvania right now, he still is a big name of the Democratic Party who is probably going to launch some sort of presidential bid or vie for some sort of cabinet position in the next Democratic administration. So there's a lot of big names, and even the vocally critical parts of the party of Israel, even the more anti-Israel voices, like the AOCs, like the Ilhan Omar and that other Palestinian woman from Michigan, they've been effectively silenced. They have been shut up, and they have not been allowed to speak on the issue, at least in any official capacity. Now they'll say what they want, but in terms of using their official influence, like I said, they've all either been compromised or silenced. And even when it comes to appealing to, like I said, that small but very fiercely loyal to the Democrats Muslim faction, they're more driven by whatever pet domestic issue the Democrats tell them to care about than the Israeli issue, and it's actually led to a very strange rollover to where you have, I think it's, I'm trying to remember his name, but it's the mayor of the only Muslim majority town in the United States, or one of the few, actually gave somewhat of an endorsement to
hmm.
Trump because he's bought in that, oh, Trump can broker some sort of peace, which, I mean, on the surface, fair enough, but I think once you do a little digging, it's like, come on, man. Um,
Like you're delusional.
yeah.
Like all his grandchildren are Jews. Like
well,
you're
well,
you're
yeah.
stupid. Like
But I will say, rhetorically, Trump has managed to talk out of both sides of his mouth with that, where he has managed to at least
yeah,
give the public image like, oh, this didn't happen under me. We're gonna get a peace agreement. We're gonna get the best. Once again, the regular Trump bloviating. So he
yeah,
might be able to take in people with that, just electorally speaking. But in terms of like what, to return to your point, any sort of, let's just say, anti-Israel especially, but even a skepticism Israel has been completely extinguished within any mainstream halls of the Democratic Party, and I think it's going to remain that way. And while you might
yeah,
get some more, say, anti-Israel or Israel skeptic people who work their way through the State Department in the next few years, especially as you get the younger generation coming in, perhaps they'll be broken by the system, or perhaps we'll get a bit more of a distancing, and I don't know, maybe they'll decide at some point it's time to cut Israel loose and move them into the diaspora, either into New York, London, wherever, or even Ukraine. I don't. You probably saw this. The one last thing I want
yeah,
to mention is, did you see that Hasidic pilgrimage to Ukraine today?
yes, yeah.
Oh, that was,
What is it, Uman or
yeah, yeah, Uman,
it's
which
the
is a very
yeah,
small town in Cherkasy Oblast, which is right on the
yeah,
border with Romania, if I have my geography correct. Where, like I said, that's the heartland of the Hasidic movement. That's where it started in those parts of Eastern Europe, especially
yeah.
in
There's
those
there's
parts.
wonderful photos of these guys bathing in a tank that's like used for people's drinking
Yeah,
water.
and I it
They're
didn't have,
they're famous. They're famous for never cleaning up after themselves. That's the kind of contempt they have.
and you probably understood more of it than me if you saw this clip. But did you see the clip of the Ukrainian woman confronting them?
No, I haven't seen it.
Yeah, like there was no subtitles, but somebody gave just a brief of what the conversation was, and I can actually, believe it or not, recognize a few words in Slavic languages here and there to the point where I might be able to piece something together given the context. I'm not going to claim to be that great of it, but let's just say I would do better than just any given language. Maybe Italian, Italian I could definitely do better in, but that's beside the point. Um, she was pretty much saying like, why are you on our water? And
Yeah,
this is our drinking water, and they were just like mocking or making like all these absurd like hand motions that probably have some sort of meaning that I'm just not privy to. And I encourage you. You'll probably have to go to Twitter to look for it. Look for that video. Look for the images. It's, let's just say, they're not going very far to dispel stereotypes. I'll just put it that way.
yeah, 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 yeah. It's like watching a Five-ish video.
You know what? You are right. And then of course there was also, I think it was also Uman, that same small town, where they were having the dance party at night. And
I remember I showed somebody at work of the Five-ish video, and my preamble was I said, "You will not be prepared for this. I'm not telling you don't prepare. I'm saying do what you can, but you will not be prepared for this." And she was in shock, absolute shock.
because
Is this
because
for real? Do they know what they're doing? I said, yeah, they do.
because you broached the topic, you know what I figured out?
Yeah.
Do you know actually Shalom Rabashkin, who was the guy who ran that kosher meat factory that Trump pardoned, was in one of those videos?
Oh God! Oh my God! It's the
Yeah,
Blump will save America. Here's how we went back to West. Thanks, Blump.
Trump is one step removed from five-ish. Just let that sink in.
It's so pathetic.
But that's definitely not how I expected to end the show, but I think it's for the best. I think that we covered some very valuable ground on that. Like I said, I encourage you to find those clips wherever you can from Uman, Ukraine, because once I'll just reiterate that they're not going very far to dispel stereotypes.
Yes, that's what a wonderful diplomatic way to put it.
What a YouTube-friendly way of putting it. Oh,
A
also,
very YouTube
that
friendly
that does
way.
remind me, because of some recent events, which I don't want to get too much in detail about, but let's just say this isn't the most open platform, so I bit the bullet, I caved. There's a Rumble channel now,
Ooh,
so I
what about
will.
BitChute? And I'm joking.
Well, the
BitChute is
BitChute, as
just
far as I
trash.
know, does automatic backup, which is why I have it. So that should be
Uh,
like
oh yeah, that's right. I forgot. I'm forgetting my own jokes. Remember my constant pressure in 2022. I would like, dead ass say, uh, we just started a Rumble account and we didn't. I know how much you didn't want to, but
well,
I couldn't.
we did it. And
Yeah.
I have some other suggestions for alternative platforms, but I'll try to remember to put the link. If not, I have one on the community post. It should be my most recent community
Okay.
post where you can find the show on Rumble. I'll definitely upload this one, and I will try to get the backlog up on that just so we have somewhere in the off chance that anything. Like I said, we're mostly small enough to stay, keep heat off of us, but you never know. I'd rather not
Yeah.
risk it.
Yeah,
So
I agree.
regardless, there's that, and there's our BitChute, which should have automatic backup. I need to check to see if I need to update that to make sure everything's still going up. But thank you everyone once again for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Thank you and take care.